Okay, hello everybody. So welcome to week 5 of the course. So this week we're going to be talking about autonomy and motivation. And so that's the wrong window. Um, so so to get started, just to get off onto the topic here. So we have to talk about autonomy with motivation. We have to first define what autonomy actually is. So it's actually kind of a complicated topic. So there's been, if you read Benson, you know that there's been several ways that it's been viewed in the past. So the first thing and the most important thing to think about with autonomy is actually an attribute of the learner. Okay, so it's not something that's connected directly to the learning situation. So if you, like for instance, dropped a learner into a situation where they had to do everything on their own, they wouldn't suddenly develop autonomy. So they wouldn't necessarily, if they didn't have the skills or the strategies beforehand, they wouldn't know what to do. So the situation doesn't really help, doesn't necessarily make the learner magically autonomous. They haven't yet taken control of their learning. So it has to be something that comes from within the learners. And another important thing to keep in mind is that freedom in learning does not equal autonomy. So the two are actually quite different. So a person can be perfectly free in knowing like what they want to learn or what they or addressing what they want to learn, or so basically they can be free in terms of how they approach things and what they want to learn, but it's not necessarily the same as taking control of their learning. So I think the best definition that we have for autonomy would be this combination that we have mentioned in Benson. So by Little, and so the definition was put together by Little in 2000 and includes his definition and also Holeg's definition from 1981. So what it says is so autonomy depends on the development and exercise of a capacity for detachment, critical reflection, decision-making, and independent action. Autonomous learners assume responsibility for determining the purpose, content, rhythm, and method of their learning, monitoring its progress, and evaluating its outcomes. So with this definition, is actually pretty, is really good because it actually takes everything and kind of synthesizes it. So it tells you what the learners need to actually have, so what abilities they need to have, and also tells you the characteristics of autonomous learners, so what they actually do. Okay, so they have to start off by having a capacity for autonomous learning. So they have to be able to reflect critically, make decisions, work independently, and then this will all kind of come out in terms of their ability to assume their responsibility in their learning, so they can actually determine how they go about learning. So autonomy, so as I said, is very complicated. So we have this definition, and out of this definition, you have kind of these different theories of what autonomy actually is. So one of those is by Noonan. So Noonan is a big name when it comes to like materials design and stuff for language learning. And so what he did is he proposed this 5-level model, and he kind of used it as a way to inform, for people who create textbooks, he uses it as a way to kind of inform them for the sequencing of activities. So he said you can actually go from these lower order autonomy type of activities to these higher order autonomy activities. And so you have like 5 levels of awareness. So meaning like, are they aware of the task and what's going on? Involvement, intervention, creation, and transcendence. We won't really go too deep into this model just because it's not the one that's going to be our main focus, but it's one of the ones that's out there. And it basically just involves a lot of the same things that we've looked at in terms of motivation theory up to this point. So promoting awareness of being able to see what needs to be done, making sure that you're involved with the task, and intervening with yourself, so kind of checking in with yourself, making sure that you're going, that you're on the right path. And then like the creation transcendence, which we haven't really talked about, but in a sense, it's kind of like you become this fully autonomous learner on your own in those two steps. So the one that we're probably going to focus on a little bit more is going to be Littlewood's model. So he has a 3-stage model. So it goes from language acquisition to learning approach to personal development. So the first stage, you have language acquisition. So this is basically where the learner operates independently with the language they're trying to use. Okay, so they take the language and they kind of try to use it to communicate personal meanings in real and unpredictable situations. Okay, so they're taking the language out of the classroom and applying it to situations they encounter outside of it. And so that's kind of going to help them to create this idea, like they can actually take this what they've learned and actually apply it to their own situations and take control of what they're learning more. So they will know better than anybody else what types of situations they're going to be in, and so they can actually apply that that language use to those situations. Learning approach, so taking responsibility for one's own learning and applying it and applying active and personally relevant strategies to it. So here you kind of know what works for you and what doesn't. And so the idea here is like part of autonomy is knowing what will work for you. And so you take control, you take responsibility for your learning by actually learning what is actually going to help you in each of these situations and applying those strategies to the new situations. And you have personal development. So that's the third stage. That's going to be so it's going to be a higher level goal in developing autonomy, and it's going to so it's a higher level goal of greater generalized autonomy as individuals. So basically, you take yourself as an individual where you are currently, and then you have this goal of becoming an even more autonomous individual, so you can actually take greater control of your learning as you go forward. Okay, so and this kind of comes in two different forms. So you have proactive autonomy and then reactive autonomy. So basically the difference is proactive autonomy, you kind of create your own directions. Okay, so you're given a task kind of as a learner, and then you have to kind of at least partially create those directions of where you're going to go. Okay, so this affirms individuality by actually making it so you can kind of put more of yourself into that task and into that creation of the task. Reactive autonomy is different in that you're given the directions ahead of time. So you have to know which direction you're going into. You're given a task and you know, okay, I have to go this general way, kind of. But it's reactive in that you have to actually take that direction and flow with it. So you have to figure out, so how are you going to get from point A to point B on your own? So you take control of that path in between the 2 points. Whereas proactive is you have to kind of set your own goal and where you're going to go. Okay, so in essence, you can kind of see that autonomy is related to, in a way, so two theories that we've talked about. So it's related to goal-oriented theory. So you have a goal that you need to reach, and so you need to find a way to get to that goal. And it's also related to self-determination theory. So and self-regulation. So you have to use these different strategies and everything that are relevant to you. You have to figure out what strategies are relevant to you in order to help like internalize these goals more, to actually develop more of this intrinsic interest in the task that you're doing and go forward with it. Yeah, so like I said, it's related to self-determination theory. And in a sense, so let's see. So so the autonomy must be closely aligned. Okay, so there must be a close alignment between pedagogical and personal goals. Okay, so in order for there to be truly autonomous individual, the pedagogical goals have to match the personal goals. If the personal goals are not met or are not in line with the pedagogical goals, then there's kind of a tension in between the two. And we'll talk about that in a second. You also have to be ready to internalize whatever you're going to be dealing with. Okay, so this is dependent on the degree the learning environment supports the sense of autonomy and self-determination. Okay, so does the learning environment allow for you to be more autonomous in your learning? Does it allow for you to take control of your learning, or are you actually being forced to do something in the way that you wouldn't normally do it in, or something that you're not at all interested in? And then learners have to be involved in decisions about the learning process. So yeah, that goes back to the first point. Learners should actually, and this kind of goes with research with like something called critical pedagogy, where people are actually put some of the onus on the learners to actually help create these learning goals for the classroom. And so by allowing the learners to be involved in that process, involved in the decisions, you're helping them to actually have a stake in that learning process. So it helps them to, so they're being, so going back to the second point up above there, so the learners are actually able to match their goals with the pedagogical goals in a way. So that helps to align those two goals. And so you can kind of work towards a higher level of autonomy in that way. Okay, so if there's a lack of autonomy, then what we have is, so learners tend to become, they view it as being trapped in negative patterns, okay? So they have negative self-perceptions, so their goals aren't matching up with the pedagogical goals, for instance. They may not, so going down to the next point, so they might attribute their lack of progress to ability or intelligence. And so that kind of leads to a pattern of learned helplessness. So in psychology, if you're familiar with psychology, learned helplessness is basically you're put in a situation where you can't really escape from it. And so you kind of just roll over and give up. Okay, so like this would go back to like examples, like, so in psychology they have examples of learned helplessness with dogs being put in like electrified cages, and so they can't escape from it, and so they just give up and give into their situation. And so if we have a lack of autonomy, we have this situation. So learners they don't feel like they have any say. Whatever they have to do is not related to their own personal goals, so they just kind of have to go with it, and then they don't really have any of this intrinsic interest in what's going on anymore. They're not part of the learning process, so they just kind of give up. And then because they give up, they can kind of attribute that low performance to their ability or intelligence, and this kind of just creates a learning environment that becomes competitive. Okay, so we'll talk more about the three different. So we talked about this a little bit already, but so you have like competitive, cooperative, and then individualistic learning styles. So in this sense, if we start to attribute things to ability or intelligence, we start to go to that competitive learning style, which is pretty much the worst style that we can have in the classroom. So there are two ways to prevent this. So learners must be taught to see motivation as coming from within. Okay, so Ushiwara talks about how learners have to see motivation as something that starts from inside. So learners have to be able to know that they can take control of their learning. Okay, so motivation kind of leads to autonomy, or the two are intertwined with each other. And then the regulation of motivation is developed by social interactive support and co-regulation. Okay, so basically people have to work together towards these goals. Okay. So going back to like sociocultural theory, which is the lens that Ushio is often using, she's saying like social interactive support, you need to have people who are within each other's zones of proximal development. So they actually can help each other, pull each other to new levels of performance and new levels of motivation. Okay, and so we've talked about this a little bit, but just to go back to it and remind you. So we see this this push to broaden the unit of analysis and motivation. Okay, so we talked last week, or I said last week, that there's this positivist tradition that's kind of dominated in the field of motivation, or the area of motivation research. So we talked about survey methodology and whatnot. So an example of that would be like the poppy study that you read last week. Okay, so so this week, what I wanted to just focus on again. So the positive tradition focuses on putting motivation within a chain of cause and effect. Okay, so you have the cause, which leads to either more motivation or less motivation. Okay, so motivation becomes the product. And so the problem with this, it offers little guidance for practitioners. So we can kind of see how motivation interacts with everything, but there's not much of an explanation of how do we change it exactly. So there's been a push for a more holistic approach, and that's because learning is constructive rather than reproductive. Okay, so learners have to work together to put together this learning environment with the teacher even. So it's not something that the teacher should just be spouting facts off, and then the learners just have to repeat those facts. So learners should be presented with some sort of a task or problem, and they have to work together to figure out how to get to the solution. So learning is going to be more constructive in that way. It's also social, cultural, and interpersonal. So people have to work together. So they have to get feedback from others. They have to learn how to help others to reach certain goals. So without these two things present, learning is not going to be very efficient, and it's not going to be something that inspires much motivation. So we need to learn. So we need to move towards this concept. So and we also need to look at the learner as the agent of their learning. Okay, so they need to take this. They need to learn that learning comes from within, and so they have to actually take control of that learning. So as a result, so Ushioda and Dornier, as we saw, are kind of pushing towards this idea to expand the unit of analysis to the interaction between the individual and social setting, rather than just looking at the individual. Okay, so the social setting plays a key role on all of this, and so we want to make sure that we're taking it into account. Okay, so some of the things that we have here. So we have social forces in learning. So some of the potentially negative ones that we have. So we have peer group influences. So especially in among adolescents, we have peer groups will have either a positive or negative influence. So the negative ones will have make it seem like knowing everything will kind of makes you seem like a nerd, or it's not cool. Classroom cultures. So how is everything working together with the students? So are the students actually working well together? How is the teacher? And then the educational system. You have the curriculum, the demands of the school, and whatnot. So this can all have an influence on whether or not the person can actually develop autonomy as a learner. And so what we have here is if we have all these negative influences, if all these are negative, then the learner is going to be less autonomous. And so that's going to have a major impact on their ability to be intrinsically pushed to be pushed to form some sort of intrinsic interest in the learning situation. Okay. Okay, and then so if we look at motivation as seen by teachers and learners, and motivation and autonomy, so we see that teachers actually view this as a collective issue. So they view motivation as something that is like a class-related issue. So either the whole class should be motivated, or the whole class is not motivated. Okay, and so this kind of relates to an idea of social relatedness. So a sense of belonging to a social unit. So students will often feel like if they're in a class, they'll belong to a social unit. So if everybody is if some people are motivated, most if not all other people should also be motivated to learn. Okay, and so they should be all working together to develop this sense of autonomy, to take control of their learning and to kind of internalize it more. Okay, so yeah, the social unit of the classroom, so the students and the teacher, the activities and whatnot, are important in developing and supporting motivation. Okay, so yeah, and the idea is that motivation has to come from within, as I've said multiple times now. So there has to be an interdependence between internal and external factors. So they should be closely related to each other. Okay, so you should have internal factors where you have the intrinsic kind of motivation you have this interest, this genuine interest in the task that's involved, or in the learning, or in the topic that you're learning about. You have some sort of say in what's going on around you, and you're kind of seen as a person that has not necessarily equal standing, but you have some standing in the class to kind of give opinions and whatnot. And you have the external factors, so typical things like the teacher's expectations, the curriculum, the classroom goals, grades, things like that. All of those should come together and kind of they should all kind of depend on each other and align with each other, more or less. Okay, so this will kind of create a situation in which motivation comes from within the individual. So if all those things are in harmony with each other, there shouldn't be a problem with the person developing a sense of themselves as an autonomous learner. So they should be able to take control of their learning, because everything is going to be related to what they view as important, what they think is interesting. If there's like tension in between any of those things, especially between the internal and external factors. So for instance, what the person finds interesting or what they want to do versus what the external factors are pushing them to do. So if somebody wants to learn and do learn something and do it in a certain way, but the external factors like the curriculum are forcing them in the opposite direction, there's going to be some negative tension that arises there. And so they won't necessarily feel like they have control of their learning. They might feel that they just have to go with the flow and so they might lose interest. Okay, so in a sense, we want to reduce those tensions. So we want to promote self-regulation in terms of, to make sure that they're actually internalizing these different things. So we want to move from the external regulation to the integrated regulation. Okay, so some of the ways that we can promote motivation. So we can encourage learners to develop their own reasons for learning. Okay, so so this is kind of like we want to promote the idea of like goal development. Okay, so we want to have learners actually take a time and reflect on why they want to learn this certain topic. Okay, so sometimes that might be difficult, especially if you're dealing with like younger learners or adolescent learners. They might not really care that much, but for the most part, you'll be able to push learners to actually develop what will be helpful for them. Okay, and even with these younger learners who don't always want to be in school, you can kind of take the time and sit down with them and kind of make them think about it. So you just have to work a little bit harder with them. And so one thing that this does is it promotes internal growth and self-regulation. Okay, so in a sense, if they develop their own reasons for learning, then they have a way to kind of make this more integrated with their internal system. Okay, and once it's more integrated with their system, they can actually take control of it more. Another way is you can use new and different activities and materials. So I know several of you in your discussion posts have talked about how you take into account everybody's different interests and styles of learning, and so this is one way you can do that. So you're not going to, and I think several of you I commented too, like you can't really. It's difficult to take into account everybody's interests and learning styles. But yeah, so by giving a new and different activities and materials and kind of cycling through them, you can kind of hit on everybody's interests and styles in that way. You just won't necessarily be able to do that with every single task. And let's see, so relate learning to own personal lives. Yeah, so you want to make sure that the learning actually has some sort of real life application to the individual. So for instance, in a language classroom, I think I've mentioned this before, but we talk about using authentic materials. So if you have authentic materials that are not necessarily adapted, so these can be things just like menus, or if you have like a more advanced class, you can have them read newspapers in the second language. These are going to be things that they see as more useful to them, and they'll get more out of it. And so they'll actually be more interested in doing it. And then the final thing you can do is you can develop a charter for the classroom. So you can have students kind of make it so the students have a say in what they learn, and kind of like the rules as well. So you can have them develop the rules for the classroom together, and you can also have them develop like the overall goals for the class. Okay, so you as a definitely don't want to let them have all the say in it, but you want to guide them with it. Okay, so you can actually help them. You can listen to their ideas and help them to kind of incorporate them into what's required of you in a way. Okay, so a lot of times if you're teaching a program, you have objectives already that you have to follow, so you can kind of take your students into account and guide them towards those objectives. And so that way it kind of makes them feel like they had a say in developing them, even though you didn't necessarily have to change that much from what you would have had to do anyway. So if they feel like they had a say in those, and you can also develop extras as well, but if they had a say in the ones that are required, then they feel like it's something that it's their own personal goal, and so they have more control over it. Okay. So that was a little bit about promoting motivation with looking at Ushioda's article and a little bit of Benson's articles as well. But so we look at Dornier's article. So he talks about cooperative learning. Okay, so when we talk about cooperative learning, it's not the same as communicative language teaching. It is related to autonomy though. So if you're talking about cooperative learning, you have these students who are working together to kind of form they kind of take control of their learning to work by working together. So the idea here is that it's not a teacher-centered classroom, but it's a student-centered classroom. So they have to work together towards a common goal. So 3 characteristics of this type of learning. So most of the class time is spent working in groups of 3 and 6. Okay, group members are motivated to ensure that peers have also mastered the materials. So it's not enough for a member of the group to individually feel like they have mastered the materials, but they feel like they have to make it so their group members have also learned. Okay, so in this way you have people who are teaching each other. So you have students who are teaching each other. And then you have, so the evaluating and rewarding of groups' achievements are as important or more important than evaluating and rewarding. Okay, oh, that's incorrect. I think I had a typo there. So I'll go back and fix that I'll post the slides and fix that. I don't remember what words were there, but so basically the achievement are more important than the achievements are more important than the evaluating and the rewarding. Okay, so whatever the group works together towards this goal, and actually achieving that goal is more important than the reward that they get from it. Okay, so the achievement in itself is kind of a reward. So this is better than competitive and individualistic classroom structures. So we talked about these earlier on. I think it was in chapter 2 or chapter 3 from Dornier and Ushioda. But so basically, competitive is related more to the idea of ability. So people believe that they so in a competitive learning situation, people will work kind of against each other to see who can be the best in the classroom. And we found that this actually can have a negative effect on people who perform lower. So it can kind of make it seem as though it can kind of give them, it can perpetuate the idea that they just don't have the ability to succeed. And then individualistic classrooms, not necessarily an awful thing, but they don't promote as much as great a learning process as those in the cooperative learning process. Okay, so people actually can learn more from each other than they can just by working on their own. Okay, so there's that. So the idea of cooperative learning is then kind of brings us so that you as the learner can work together with individuals so you can get that. So Ushio mentioned those two characteristics that you need to be a good autonomous learner. And so the second one was actually like co-regulation, and it's like kind of looking at the social context of the classroom. And so the cooperative learning would bring that into play here. So you have like as a group, you're kind of co-regulating each other. So you're working using these different strategies for your learning, and then also internalizing the goal, okay, to into your own motivational system. So several things that you can do. So to apply cooperative learning, so you have to structure the goals. So you have to make sure that the goals are understood by the people. Structure the rewards, make sure that they are well understood. Structure student roles. So if you have groups of 3 or 6, you have to make sure the students all know what their role is. So, for instance, if you have, I think an example of this would be something that I did with like my ESL students in the past. I've done something called a reading circle, where each person in the reading circle has a specific role for each week. Okay, so one person has to report to the class, one person has to provide discussion questions for the group, and so on. Okay, so if you structure student roles, then they kind of know what they have to do, and then they can kind of go from there. Okay, so this might be more of an example of a that would be an example of a reactive autonomy. An example of like proactive autonomy in that situation would be like letting students know in general what their roles are as the learners in a cooperative learning situation, so what they need to accomplish, and just kind of letting them go from there. Okay, so yeah, so structuring materials, so making sure the materials are clear. So giving students like very set materials for each kind of activity that they need to do, so they can easily follow through it in their groups, and then structuring the rules. Okay, so yeah, I think that was pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so yeah, so with cooperative learning, there needs to be an emphasis on classroom goal structure. So as a class, everybody needs to be able to know that they are going for this similar goal that they all need to reach. And there also needs to be an idea of group cohesiveness. Okay, so group members need to work together in order to get to the end of the task. So they need to work together to achieve. And so if students are actually working together cooperatively, they work well together. That actually leads to improved student attitudes. Okay, so they actually can actually get more out of the activity in that way, because they're actually working together in a positive environment. So they're learning from each other, teaching each other, and then also helping each other to co-regulate. There's co-regulation in their groups in terms of like learning what strategies are efficient, and how they can, and so that leads to more internalization and better student attitudes towards the learning task. Okay, so I mean that's kind of like an overview of what we had to read for the week, and so you kind of see that like autonomy is really important in terms of promoting students' learner involvement in learning, so they actually know what they need to do. They can figure out how they can get there. They can develop more of the way like they actually have a say in like the objectives, and so as a way that it relates, and so And so that relates to our ideas of like goal-orientedness or goal-oriented theory and then self-determination theory, because it helps to make it so the students have a goal. They can actually individually develop their own goals and get to them. So, and in a way, this is supposed to also help them to learn how to develop those proximal goals that are used as stepping stones. And then you also have the self-regulation theory. So through autonomy, they're more capable of taking control of their learning and then making it so that it's internalized in their system. One thing that we need to make sure that we know about, though, is a few cautions with the idea of autonomy here. Okay, so there's often an assumed relationship between levels of autonomy and language proficiency. Okay, and so if we look at that, it doesn't really hold up. Okay, so Kumaravidivalu, so she points out there's not a necessary correlation between the two. Okay, and so that's mainly because they're two independent skills. So we can see that in the definition for autonomy. So autonomy depends on this underlying capacity for detachment, critical reflection, decision-making, and independent action. Okay, so you have to have a certain capacity for doing this. You have to develop the ability here. And so this isn't necessarily the same thing as learning a language, for instance. So be very careful with when we talk about autonomy. It's not necessarily related to language proficiency. Okay, so there's not a direct connection there. It is directly related to levels of motivation, though. Okay, so the more autonomous the learner, the more motivated they're going to be. Okay. Another thing, so we talk about how autonomy can be, developing autonomy in learners is actually really helpful for developing their motivation to learn, but there's been some discussion about how autonomy may not be viewed positively in all cultures. Okay, so if you're teaching in a certain culture, there may be some pushback against this idea of autonomy. So some cultures may not value it the same way that we do here. It is a very Western ideal to be an autonomous learner, to take control of your own learning, to work independently. But I mean, so if you can use it, do, because it will be useful for helping to develop that sense of that motivation they need, that self-regulation, that those goals. Okay. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the lecture for this week. I hope that all made sense. If there's something that's not quite clear, just email me, as always. And so there's also, so be sure, after you watch this, be sure to watch your group members' presentation for their article on Kim 2009. And the two discussion questions will be related directly to the Kim article this week. Okay, so a few assignments. So your project proposals. So they're supposed to be due next week. I might push it back a week. I'll let you know, though. It'll say on the project proposal assignment sheet that I post, which I'll post probably tomorrow or Thursday. And so, yeah, it'll probably be the week after that will be due. And then you have to read for next week the Sugita, McEwen, Knowles, and Chafee. So that's Impress. So that article is on there. Ushioda 2006. But that's going to be the group presentation article next week. And then you have Dernier 2010. And then also for this week, also make sure that you do the discussion forum posts on Kim 2009 that your classmates have put together. Okay. Okay, so that's it for today, or this week for me. So if you have any questions, just email me, and have a good week.